The story of the flying fortress does not begin in the skies over Europe, but in the imaginations of engineers who, in the early 1930s, dared to believe that an aircraft could be built to withstand the violence of World War II before anyone knew how terrible the coming conflict would be. The B-17 did not earn its name from propaganda or poetic exaggeration. It earned it from the people who tried to kill it, the people who flew it, and the people who watched in disbelief as it returned home again and again with holes large enough to walk through. To understand why crews called it the Flying Fortress, you have to hear their voices, the men who strapped themselves inside aluminum skins and trusted that this machine, this miracle of engineering, would carry them through the storm. Those crews were young, most barely out of school, many never having flown before they enlisted. They found themselves assigned to a machine whose reputation preceded it. Even in training, instructors told them, "If anything will get you home, it's a fortress." It was a statement made with authority, but the real meaning of that promise would only reveal itself once these men were thousands of feet above enemy territory, surrounded by flak bursts and howling fighter engines, trying to keep their aircraft in the air while the world around them came undone. The B-17's design philosophy was straightforward: redundancy, strength, and survivability. Every critical system had a backup. Some had two, multiple hydraulic systems, multiple control pathways. A heavy, rugged frame that could soak up punishing damage. Even the fuel tanks were self-sealing, a luxury early in the war. But what transformed the aircraft from a sturdy bomber into a legend was how all these parts worked together under the most extreme conditions imaginable. What looked like over-engineering on the ground became salvation in the air. Those conditions intensified the moment the 8th Air Force began operations over Europe. The skies above Germany were some of the deadliest airspace anywhere in World War II. The Luftwaffe fought fiercely. Anti-aircraft batteries lined the routes to factories, shipyards, and rail hubs. Bombers flew straight and level, forced to maintain course for accuracy, which made them easy targets. The B-17's strength was not theoretical. It was about to be tested every mission, every mile. Early crews quickly learned what kind of machine they were flying. In some squadrons, veterans would walk new arrivals out to a returning fortress just to show them the damage the aircraft could survive. A nose torn open, a wing shredded, the tail nearly severed, mechanics climbing inside holes big enough for two men. These scenes weren't rare, they were routine. Every returning aircraft was a testament to improbable survival. For the young men about to fly their first mission, it was both reassurance and warning. One of the earliest stories that spread through airfields came from a crew who limped home with one engine dead, another coughing oil, a third overheating, and a fourth barely holding on. The fortress had taken so much flak that the pilot could see the landscape below through holes in the fuselage. Control cables had snapped, hydraulic lines were severed, and the aircraft felt as if it were held together by will alone. And yet it flew. The crew coaxed it across the channel, nursing it inch by inch. When they landed, the aircraft collapsed on the runway, unable to move further, but it had brought them home. Stories like these shaped the way crews viewed their aircraft. They didn't just respect it, they trusted it. Many described the fortress as a living thing, something with a spirit, a presence that made them feel protected even when nothing else in the sky did. They talked to the aircraft, they pleaded with it, they promised it things, they slapped its metal skin for luck before takeoff, and after missions where they should have died but didn't, some swore the aircraft had made decisions on its own, fighting to keep them alive. For the men inside, every mission began the same way. Climbing into the belly of the fortress felt like entering a separate world. The aluminum skin amplified the sound of boots on the metal walkway. The interior smelled of oil, gun cleaner, and cold air. Even on the ground, it was always cold. They passed through the narrow tunnel into the nose compartment, or climbed into the top turret, or squeezed into the cramped ball turret where the gunner curled up like a child inside a steel womb. Each station had its own rhythm, its own rituals. The engines were the heartbeat. Four Wright R1820 Cyclones rattled the airframe as they roared to life. Their deep, pulsing vibration soaked through the metal bones of the fortress, through the seat frames, through the boots of the men, settling into their chests until it matched their own pulse. Pilots always remembered the moment the aircraft lifted from the runway, heavy with bombs, climbing steadily into the morning haze, joining the formations of dozens, then hundreds of fortresses rising to meet the day's mission. Formation flying was both beautiful and brutal. From a distance, the bombers looked like an immense flock of metallic birds glinting in the sun, but inside, the reality was claustrophobic. Pilots had to maintain tight discipline, never drifting, never relaxing, because bombs from above or slight misalignment could tear into another aircraft. Everyone depended on everyone else. Formation meant survival. Lone fortresses rarely returned. As they crossed the coast and entered hostile territory, flak became the first enemy. Black puffs dotted the sky, each burst throwing razor-sharp fragments in every direction. The air filled with concussive shockwaves that rattled teeth and equipment. Crews often described the experience as flying through a field of exploding anvils. The fortress trembled under the impacts. Sometimes the cockpit windows cracked. Sometimes a burst punched holes through the wings or fuselage. And always the men braced themselves for what came next, because flak was only the beginning, then came the fighters. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove in from all angles, spitting cannon fire and tracers. Dozens of guns from the fortress opened up in reply. The sound inside the aircraft was overwhelming, a chorus of .50 caliber machine guns thundering in unison. The vibrations shook the frame. Shell casings rained down across the floors. Gunners shouted warnings over the interphone, but the noise swallowed most words. This was the moment where the flying fortress earned its name not just from its armor but from its firepower. 13 machine guns covered nearly every angle of approach. Gunners at each station created overlapping fields of fire, turning the bomber into a rotating sphere of destruction that fighters had to penetrate to reach the vulnerable centers. Enemy pilots soon learned, attacking a B-17 meant taking a gamble with your life, but the Luftwaffe adapted. They aimed for the engines, the cockpit, the tail. They used rockets, cannons, coordinated attacks from above and below. And still the fortress endured. Even with entire sections shot away, even with engines on fire or wings torn open, the B-17 often refused to fall. Crews learned that if they could just keep the aircraft pointed west, if they could just cross the coastline, odds swung dramatically in their favor. The fortress, battered and broken, would push itself home. One of the most astonishing stories came from a crew whose B-17 was nearly cut in half by cannon fire. The tail section was hanging by a few twisted metal spars, the waist guns dangling uselessly. The tail gunner lost interphone contact and had no idea whether the rest of the crew was alive. He kept firing anyway, determined to do his job for as long as the aircraft remained airborne. Miraculously, the pilot managed to keep flying, compensating for the lack of stability with brute force and instinct. When they landed, mechanics stared in disbelief. The aircraft shouldn't have stayed together, but it had. The fortress had given them one more chance. Machines alone cannot explain these stories. The B-17 was extraordinary, but human determination played an equal role. Some pilots flew their aircraft long after others would have bilayed out. Some co-pilots manually pumped landing gear down when hydraulics failed. Some engineers crawled along shattered catwalks mid-flight to put out fires or reconnect cables. These acts weren't rare, they were woven into the daily reality of bomber crews. Inside the aircraft, the bond between crew members was unlike anything found elsewhere. Each man depended on the others completely. The top turret gunner protected the pilots. The tail gunner guarded their blind spot. The navigator kept them on course through clouds of smoke and fire. The bombardier guided the aircraft into the most dangerous part of the mission, straight and level over the target, while the rest of the crew fought to keep the fortress alive. Every man aboard had a job that could mean life or death for the others, and because every man relied on the fortress, they came to see it not simply as a machine but as a member of the crew, something with a personality, something with resilience, something that wanted them to live. There are countless accounts of fortresses limping home with so much damage that they looked like ghosts of their former selves, skin peeled away, ribs exposed, engines dead, fires smoldering, control cables cut, holes big enough to crawl through. Yet somehow they made it. Crews returning with trembling hands often said the same thing: it shouldn't have flown, but it did. The stories spread through airfields like legends. The fortress with half a tail, the fortress that lost 11 feet of wing and still returned, the fortress that came home with a bomb trapped inside its bay. The fortress flown back by wounded pilots, by co-pilots, by engineers, by anyone still conscious enough to grab the controls. And more than once by no pilot at all, landing on its own, guided by nothing more than gravity and luck. Crews began to talk about the B-17 with reverence. They didn't boast openly, they weren't that kind of men. But there was a quiet confidence among them, a belief that their machine gave them the best chance of surviving the kind of missions that should have ended in silence and smoke. When a fortress failed to return, the loss resonated not just because of the men aboard, but because of what the aircraft represented. Every B-17 that didn't come back felt like a fallen warrior, a giant brought down by overwhelming odds. The men who survived knew that their aircraft had given them everything it had, sometimes more than it should have. Part 1 ends as the legends begin to spread, stories whispered across mess halls, told over cold meals, passed between crews like sacred truth. The Flying Fortress was no ordinary bomber. It was something different, something remarkable, something alive in the way only machines forged in fear and fire can be. the world would soon learn just how far its crews could push it and how far the fortress would go to bring them home. The men who climbed into the flying fortress every morning learned quickly that war was not simply a contest of machines or nations. It was a test of nerves, bone, steel, and the strange, stubborn spaces inside a human being that don't break even when everything else is trying to. The B-17 was built to survive enemy fire, but its crews had to survive something worse: the knowledge that today might be the day the sky finally cracked open and swallowed them whole. Once the engines thundered awake and the ground crew rolled away their chocks, the fortress felt less like a machine and more like a living beast. The aircraft trembled as it taxied, the rivets humming, the wings quivering under the strain of thousands of pounds of bombs. No one spoke in those last moments before takeoff. The men sat with their thoughts, staring at the frosted windows, waiting for the signal that would fling them into a world where every breath had weight. The tail gunner, often the youngest on board, would look out at the runway stretching into the fog and wonder, not for the first time, why he had volunteered to sit in the loneliest, most exposed little glass bubble on the plane. The pilot, hands sweating inside his gloves, would glance sideways at his co-pilot, both pretending to look calm. The radio operator would check his equipment again, even though he had done so twice already. The waist gunners would pat the cold steel of their .50 caliber machine guns, hoping each one would keep firing when the moment came. And then takeoff. The B-17 lifted heavy and angry, its four engines clawing the air as the wheels left the ground. Rising into the gray, the fortress joined the growing formation of bombers, dozens climbing together, turning into a long, glittering chain that stretched for miles. From the air, they looked invincible. From the inside, they felt anything but. The climb to altitude was not simply uncomfortable, it was punishing. As the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, the metal walls grew icy to the touch. The wind seeped through every seam. Oxygen masks became lifelines. Fingers numbed, frostbite lurked like a thief waiting for the slightest mistake. Even before the Germans arrived, the sky itself was stripping them down. Once the formation leveled off, the crew knew they were committed. There was no turning back. The target lay hundreds of miles away, past flak belts and fighter zones, beyond the black lines on the navigator's charts. So they settled into their roles, each man watching, waiting, bracing. Out the windows, the world below seemed peaceful: patchwork fields, winding rivers, snow-covered roofs, but the stillness was an illusion. They were crossing enemy territory. The bombing run had begun long before the bombs were armed. The first warning signs seldom came with sound. The fighter escorts would dip their wings, signaling what they saw ahead. The bombardier, squinting through the glass nose, would be the next to notice, glints far off, specks moving fast. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the bomber like a man in a steel womb, would whisper into his mic, "Movement, 11 o'clock high." The Germans always came like ghosts at first, silent, patient, weaving between the clouds as if testing the air. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, planes designed with one purpose: to tear the fortress apart before it reached the target. They had learned that the B-17's strength was not its armor or firepower, but its formation. A single bomber was a doomed animal. A pack of them was a bristling porcupine that could shred anything foolish enough to attack head-on. So the Luftwaffe attacked with precision, timing their dives and bursts so that every exposed inch of the bomber was probed for weakness. The first tracer rounds looked almost beautiful, tiny sparks streaking through the air. Then they shattered the illusion as they swept past the cockpit or tore across the fuselage, punching ragged holes through aluminum. The gunners responded instantly. The entire aircraft erupted into noise, violent, concussive, deafening noise. The .50 caliber guns shook the men's arms to their bones, spit flames into the slipstream, and left hot brass rolling across the floor. In the chaos, the men rarely saw the fighters clearly. They saw only flashes, silhouettes, and the sudden scream of engines as the enemy tore past. The tail gunner tracked a Messerschmitt racing directly toward him, its cannons glowing like angry eyes. He squeezed his triggers and felt the recoil slam his body back. The German plane flashed by, trailing smoke, but whether he hit it or whether its attack simply ended, he would never know. Inside the bomber, the sound was overwhelming. The airframe groaned, the engines howled, the guns hammered without mercy. The intercom crackled with shouts, some clear, some garbled, some cut off abruptly. Yet in that storm of steel and fire, the men found a kind of rhythm. The waist gunners worked in brutal, beautiful synchronization, one firing while the other reloaded or scanned the skies. The pilot kept formation, refusing to drift even a foot off course, because to drift meant breaking the tight defensive wall that kept them alive. The navigator plotted adjustments with trembling fingers. The bombardier checked his Norden bomb sight, knowing that soon his entire aircraft would hinge on his aim. The Germans hit again and again. Each pass tore something away: a piece of wing, a sheet of metal, a chunk of tail. One gunner screamed as a round grazed his thigh. Another shouted that his gun had jammed. The radio operator felt hot oil splash across his jacket when an engine took a hit. Still they held formation. Flak was next. Flak was not precise. It was not a duel between fighters or a disciplined exchange of gunfire. Flak was raw hatred, an entire city's worth of guns hurling explosive shells into the sky in great black blossoms. As the fortresses approached the target, the air turned violent. Shrapnel burst around them with deafening force, shaking the aircraft so hard the men felt their teeth rattle. The sky filled with black smoke and fiery bursts, each one capable of ripping off a wing. The bombardier, now lying prone in the nose, centered the crosshairs while the ship lurched and bucked. The pilot held the plane steady with pure willpower, flying straight and level into a storm of invisible knives. This was the deadliest moment of any mission. The bombardier took control of the aircraft. Every other crewman watched helplessly as the bomber became a floating target, committed to a perfectly straight path, the very thing every instinct told them never to do in combat. Through the glass, they could see other fortresses being hit. One bomber erupted into orange flame, breaking apart as men tumbled out, their parachutes blooming behind them like white flowers against the dark clouds. Another spiraled downward, trailing smoke, its tail missing. The formation closed ranks but could not save those who fell. Then came the moment, the bombardier's voice steady through the intercom, "Bombs away." The plane suddenly lifted as the weight released, a strange, sudden lightness that felt almost like relief. But the mission was not over. They still had to survive the return. The enemy fighters, often waiting beyond the flak zone, came after them again. This time the formation was ragged, damaged, bleeding. Many bombers dropped out, limping on failing engines, leaking fuel, their crews scrambling to keep the aircraft alive long enough to make it home. Some flew alone, death sentences in the open sky. The B-17s that fell out of formation were like wounded animals, stalked by the fighters that circled overhead. Yet time after time, the flying fortress refused to die. Crews told stories of wings shredded like canvas, engines blown apart, and the fuselage riddled with holes. They returned home with tails missing, with noses shattered, with landing gear locked in place or blown away entirely. They returned with wounded men holding towels to their legs, with gunners firing one-handed after shrapnel tore through their positions, with pilots guiding the crippled ship using only the trim tabs after the controls snapped in two. Sometimes the impossible happened. A B-17 once returned with a section of the wing missing big enough for a man to crawl through. Another made it back with an engine hanging by its mounts and the entire fuselage bent in the middle like a cracked spine. One fortress landed safely despite having more than 1,000 holes in its body, literal daylight pouring through the aircraft, but these miracles came at a cost. Inside the bomber, the men counted injuries as they counted ammunition. A waist gunner might slump to the floor, blood pooling beneath him, while his friend shouted for the medic. A radio operator might find his hands shaking uncontrollably, the shock setting in as he looked down at the jagged tear in his jacket where shrapnel had passed inches from his ribs. The tail gunner might discover his turret was jammed, leaving him helpless as fighters returned for another run. Still they fought, still they flew, still they survived more often than they should have. Hours later, when the coastline finally appeared through the haze and the sea faded into the familiar contours of England, the men would feel a wave of exhaustion so complete it left them trembling. Landing the aircraft was sometimes more dangerous than combat. The battered fortresses came in crooked, heavy, and barely controllable. Some skidded off the runway, shields buckling. Others landed short, collapsing onto their bellies as the crews scrambled out. But when the engines finally cut off, when the silence returned and the ground crew swarmed around them with wide eyes, the men of these felt something powerful and indescribable. The fortress had brought them home. It had taken everything the enemy threw at it, fire, steel, explosives, the full fury of a nation, and still refused to let go. World War II had witnessed many aircraft, but none other seemed to carry within it the strange insistence on survival that defined the flying fortress. And nowhere was that more evident than in the stories the men told, tales of planes that should have fallen, guns that should have jammed, and lives that should have ended. But the fortress was not done. Its legend was only beginning to take shape, and by the end of the war, its reputation would grow into something almost mythic, a symbol of what men could endure when locked inside a machine that refused to surrender. More than once, crews would step off a mangled B-17, look back at the shredded wings and twisted fuselage, and whisper the same thing every time. How did she stay in the air? The truth, spoken quietly among them, was that they were not just flying in the fortress. They were surviving through it. As the war dragged on, the men flying in the B-17 could feel the change long before the newspapers printed it. At first it was subtle. a mission canceled due to bad weather instead of pushed through anyway, a briefing where the intelligence officer didn't have that tightness around his eyes, a flight path that bent just slightly beyond the reach of the fighter belts that once waited for them like wolves. But the real difference lay in the sky itself. The Luftwaffe was thinning. Every crewman in a flying fortress could sense it. They still saw fighters, still heard the scream of cannon shells ripping past their wings, still felt the stomach-turning jolt when flak burst too close. But the attacks were no longer the frenetic, coordinated swarms that had once chewed entire groups to pieces. Now the German pilots came in singles or pairs, desperate, skilled, often fearless, but alone. Their planes rattled, smoked, stuttered. Some even broke off engagements early, trailing problems that had nothing to do with enemy fire. The fortress crews didn't celebrate. They'd lost too many men to believe the danger had passed. But in their hearts they recognized what this meant. The enemy's strength was bleeding out. Still the missions continued. Every morning the men dressed in the same heavy gear, breathed the same frigid oxygen at altitude, watched the same tracers arc past the same scarred aluminum skin. But day by day, month by month, the B-17s began to bring their crews home more often. They were still battered, still gashed, still riddled with holes, but they were returning. Then one morning, after a mission so uneventful it felt almost surreal, a pilot stepped off his fortress, looked at the sky and said quietly, "We might actually live to see the end." That was a dangerous thing to say. Superstitious aircrews didn't like tempting fate, but the feeling was spreading now, unspoken but undeniable. The fortress was no longer fighting a losing war, it was pushing the enemy back. The crews noticed something else too. New men were beginning to arrive on base, fresh from training, faces unlined by fear. They walked with confidence, unaware of the ghosts hanging over the bunks and empty tables in the mess hall. The veterans watched them calmly, sometimes with protectiveness, sometimes with envy. They remembered what it felt like to step onto a base before the reality of combat had carved itself into your bones. The newcomers would soon learn. Everyone did, but the veterans also knew something the rookies didn't. The odds were finally turning. As spring returned to Europe, the landscape transformed beneath the bomber formations. Where once they had flown over enemy cities, they now flew over liberated territory. The rivers ran free of smoke. The rail yards that had once been choked with Nazi supplies now sat silent and shattered. Roads crawled with retreating convoys. The front line was no longer a distant idea, it was a moving force pushing Germany inward from all sides. For the air crews of the flying fortresses, the missions changed too. They were no longer relentless, punishing attacks into the heart of an enemy at full strength. Now they were the relentless pressure that prevented the enemy from ever regaining it, and the B-17, stubborn to the last rivet, was still flying. On one mission late in the war, a fortress returned to base missing an entire engine. Its nose bent downward at an unnatural angle, its left wing almost shredded. The pilot had held the controls so tightly for so long that his fingers had to be pried away. He stepped out into the sunlight, blinked hard at the sudden brightness, and whispered, "She didn't want to quit." So neither did we. By now, stories like this were no longer rare, they were routine. Tales of fortresses limping home with half their instruments dead. Tales of waste gunners firing until their barrels glowed red and their arms felt like anchors. Tales of bombers landing on 3 wheels or 2 or none. Tales of planes drifting so close to stall that the ground crews ran alongside them as they slid to a stop. But the most unbelievable stories were the ones that never made the official reports. The things the crews told each other quietly late at night when the missions were done and the air outside tasted of damp grass and engine oil. One crew swore their radio operator survived a direct hit because the shrapnel had ricocheted off his thermos. Another said their plane flew 50 miles with its hydraulic lines shot out, controlled only by brute strength and sheer stubbornness. Another told of a fortress whose tail was so shredded that the wind blew straight through the fuselage, yet the pilot somehow kept it stable long enough to glide home. There were stories of waste gunners who refused morphine so they could keep firing, of bombardiers who guided a crippled ship after the pilot was wounded, of crewmen who crawled out onto the wing mid-flight to extinguish a fire with their own hands. Every squadron had stories like that, every fortress group had legends, every airfield had heroes, and then the war began to end, the missions slowed, the briefings became shorter, the targets fewer. And one day, after returning from a routine sortie, the men stepped off their fortresses and found the base strangely quiet. Officers were talking in low voices. Mechanics wiped their hands on their overalls and gathered near the hangars. Someone ran from the radio shack shouting a single word that echoed across the field: "Surrender!" For a moment, no one moved. The war had been a constant, an unbreakable weight pressing down on their lives for so long that the absence of it felt unreal. They looked at one another almost suspiciously, as if someone might suddenly yell that it was a mistake. But it was. Germany had surrendered. The World War II air war in Europe, the grinding, bloody, relentless battle fought across the frozen skies was finally over. Some men cheered, some cried, some just sat down on the grass and stared at the fortresses sitting silent on the tarmac, the machines that had carried them through hell, the machines they had cursed, praised, bled on, and trusted with their lives. Now they were simply airplanes again. The crew chiefs, who had worked through endless nights repairing impossible damage, rested their hands on the battered noses of their planes. The gunners, who had stared down fighters at point-blank range, traced the bullet holes in the fuselage. The pilots, who had memorized every vibration and sound of their ship, climbed back into the cockpit one last time, just to sit there, breathing in the silence. The men knew something else, too, something they didn't say aloud. They had survived because the fortress had survived. When the crews were finally told to prepare their aircraft for the long trip back to the United States, a strange sadness filled the base. The fortresses would fly home, but not all would remain in service. The war had no more missions for them. Many of the planes would be scrapped, melted down, forgotten in scrapyards that smelled nothing like the cold, sharp air thousands of feet above Europe. Some crews begged to keep their aircraft together. One pilot wrote a letter requesting that his plane be preserved because, as he put it, "She brought all 10 of us home every single time." Another crew offered to pool their pay to buy their bomber. They didn't want to lose her, they couldn't imagine leaving her behind. But war machines were tools, not family, at least on paper. To the men who flew in them, that was a lie. When the final flights began, the airfields were lined with ground crew who saluted as the B-17s rolled past. The engines thundered one last time, and the fortresses climbed into the sky with the same stubborn determination they had shown over enemy territory. But this time no fighters chased them, no flak burst around them, no one was trying to kill them, they were going home. Some bombers didn't make the trip because they were simply too damaged to fly. Those were the ones that hurt the most to leave behind. Crews walked through their empty fuselages one last time, touching the gun mounts, the radio sets, the navigation tables where men had lived and worked and prayed. They stood in the bomb bay, imagining the missions where they had listened to the whistle of bombs falling away. They looked out through the bullet-riddled windows and inhaled memories they knew they would never describe properly. The planes stayed where they were. Silent, proud, their battle's over. But even as they said goodbye, the men knew the truth. The fortress would never really disappear. The stories couldn't be scrapped. The legends couldn't be melted down. The memories couldn't be erased. Years later, veterans would gather at reunions and talk about their missions. They would joke about the cold, the food, the crusted ice on their oxygen masks. They would speak quietly about the losses. But when the conversation turned to the fortress, their eyes changed. Softer, brighter, more alive. They spoke of the machine as if it had a soul. A pilot would say, "She took a beating that would have killed anything else." A gunner would add, "She always kept us in the air even when we thought we were done." A navigator would nod and whisper, "She brought us home." Not every bomber could be saved. Not every crew survived. But the B-17 carved its name into the history of World War II not by luck or design alone. It was the men inside it who proved what courage looked like in the face of terror, freezing air, and impossible odds. And it was the machine beneath their boots that refused again and again to let death claim them. The flying fortress was more than a bomber. It was hope made of aluminum and fire. It was the stubborn heart of an air war that should have broken the men who fought it. It was the machine that wouldn't quit, even when shredded, burning, or flying with pieces missing. It was the fortress that refused to die. And because of that, so did the men inside it. Their stories live on, not because they were extraordinary men, but because ordinary men did extraordinary things in a machine that carried them farther than they believed they could go. The B-17 did not end the war alone, but it became the symbol of what it meant to survive the impossible. If you stand in a museum today beside one of the few remaining fortresses, you can still feel it, the echo of engines that once shook the clouds, the rattle of .50 caliber guns, the cold wind of high altitude, and the quiet heartbeat of a machine built not just to fight but to endure. And if you listen closely, you might hear something else too. The voices of the men who once climbed inside, took a deep breath, and trusted their lives to the flying fortress, the plane that brought them home.